Depression is a lot different than what most people think it is. If you look today why we have so many unhappy, melancholy people, and if you also look at the bellies of most people around the world that are distended, bloated, filled with nonsense, and what's inside of that belly if we unlock the key and opened it up, which is a totally discontent flora and fauna. Pro and prebiotics are not what they should be. You have too little of good bacteria, too much of bad bacteria. This is where most depression begins. And it has very little to do with what we'll talk about next, the psychological aspect of depression. We now know that serotonin, which is figuratively the happy juice that prevents depression in the human brain, in great part comes from the intestinal tract. 70 to 80% of this happy juice that prevents the chemistry in the brain that creates depression from occurring. And if this is in disorder, the intestinal tract's in disorder, obviously we're not producing that serotonin. Now when the serotonin doesn't come up, it works in orchestration with what we call the conductors of thought in the brain, and they're neuroreceptors, which are chemistries that go from one cell to another, and each cell has a receptor site on it. And this isn't working the way it should. Dopamine doesn't occur. Endorphins are staggered. And so everything that supports healthy thought, happy thought, is starved to death, literally, by having the lack of these happy juices that start in the epicenter of the intestinal tract. Now, if you have that situation, which I estimate probably 85 to 90% of the people have, then you have trauma in your life, unresolved circumstances, situations, events. Then it's a very easy thing for that memory to seed inside of the human brain and constantly repeat itself, replay itself like a bad horror movie. If a brain has a resilience from the chemistry that initiate with all of these wonderful hormones that we just discussed for you, the likelihood for that to seed is very small. So when you see a person who's perky and happy no matter what happens to them, they're optimists, as we say, I can assure you in 100% of the cases, their hormonal chemistry is functioning. It's impossible for that not to be true. For people you see that are always unhappy, always sad, you may have known them from the time they were children, and they still are unhappy and sad, they've always had this problem. So when we've worked with depressed people and our psychotherapists deeply delve into it and do the talk therapy necessary to bring them up out of the cave, as I say, in this one, and then we change the diet and encourage particular supplementation that target this type of circumstance. The resolve is amazing. Now, we estimate that about 80% of people that have any form of psychiatric disorder, everything from easy to moderate depression to bipolar to schizophrenia, if they work well, work hard with competent physicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, and who are in the know of what we're discussing today, 80% of them can eventually reverse and not need the medication. 20% we've discovered, thank goodness for the medical medication. It lets people who a generation ago would have been institutionalized function. But 80% of you have a way out. When we look at one of the scary disorders today, it's autism. And autism, in fact, has been estimated to now be touching about 40% of children as they're born. By the year 2025, the estimate is 50% of the children born will have autism. Probably the number one advocate who scientifically validated these numbers, we all saw it happening, we all watched the burgeoning, that's too small a word, explosion of autism over the last 30 to 40 years, was Dr. Seneff, one of the professors at MIT, who validated what all of us knew was happening. And we have been specializing and categorically putting different disorders into different little compartments. Now we recognize that disorders like dyslexia, attention deficit disorder, and severe autism, as well as Asperger's disease, which is called functional autism. Some of the geniuses you know, by the way, are Asperger autistic people. They don't have limits in their brain. All fit on what we call the autistic scale. And as soon as we came to this realization in the last few years, handful of years, it was an aha moment. So now, all of these people that we've worked with, everything from severe autistic people down to dyslexics, down to people with Asperger's disease, who outshrewd you most of the time, to people who, by the way, have, what we would call moderate forms of autism, can be helped. Now, what this is, there's no doubt in any of our minds that it's heavy metal and chemical poisoning of the human brain. It may have happened when you were in the womb, starting with your mother, most likely. It may have happened because of chemicals that you took after that. As Dr. Seneff so wisely said, after MIT, the most important scientific organization and university on the planet Earth, did research, they showed that the #1 cause was high fructose corn syrup. It's a genetic modification that's in high fructose corn syrup. They said that laminated floors contribute to this, and they said yes, in some cases, that inoculations contribute to this. You may want to read the book Thimerosal, written by a Harvard doctor, a Tufts University doctor, and Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., who's an environmental attorney. And they intentionally put inside of all of your inoculations globally, and most of them here in North America and the United States, ethyl mercury. Now, if you don't know what that is, look it up on the internet, see what ethyl mercury does to help your brain, as a joke. And so all of these things we do know to be true, and there may be other things that we've yet to discover, but what we know is that when you start to detoxify, eliminate those things from the brain, from the body, from the neurological system, from the intestinal tract, from the bloodstream, that we start to see improvements. We're not going to say that 100% of people with severe autism is going to get well. Have I seen it happen? Yes, I have seen it happen. We're not going to say that everyone who has ADD is going to become perfectly well, but ADD is much easier to deal with than severe autism. Am I saying everyone with dyslexia is going to be 100% perfect? No, but we have seen exceptions where people do become completely normalized. And so if you can eliminate the cause, heavy metals, toxins, etc., before they've scarred the brain, before they've actually created a disorder in the brain, you have a lot that you can do to reverse or prevent further degradation with this disease. I'm part of the baby boom generation, and it's now taught to us by the conservative research scientists that 25% of us will have Alzheimer's disease. Now, Alzheimer's is the most critical form of dementia. So if 25% of my generation will not know they're married, will not know they have children, will not know they have grandchildren, will not know what they did for a living, that's a pretty frightening statistic and a fact and reality. Now, over the decades, I've started to recognize that there's causative reasons for that. Number one, I'm on a 25-year research study globally now, where I've concluded without any question that 70% of us lack B12. So 70% of the global population lacks B12. Meat, dairy, fish eaters, etc., they have an 8% higher incidence of B12 deficiency than do vegans. The ones who have the least are raw food vegans, like me, like the Hippocrates lifestyle. But we even need B12 supplementation. That presents a second problem. Most B12 supplementation is achemical, has very little to do with B12. B12 is a soil-based microorganism. When it was discovered, back 70, 80 years ago, they didn't know what a pre and probiotic was, these healthy bacteria. So they put it improperly into the B category. But you need an independent, living form of B12 supplementation. It's the only supplement I can look you in the eye without hesitation and tell you, you and everyone you love and everyone you know and everyone you ever talk to better be taking this daily. Unless you want dementia, neurological problems, pain, suffering. If you're into that, don't take B12. The second thing is essential fatty acids. That this is a major problem. We all have saturated fat. The brain's not made of saturated fat. It's made of essential fatty acids. The structure of your brain is fat. So when we were children and people used to try to insult us by saying we were fatheads, we should have thanked them. The fatter your head is, seemingly, the smarter you are, the better you are. And so we want to get this omega oil. Now, of course, today the mantra, which is totally incorrect, is fish oil. Fish oil will give you cancer, will give you heart disease, will contribute to diabetes. There's no doubt about that, and is a very poor source of omega. The mantra today, unfortunately, is fish oil. Nobody ever thinks, where does a fish get the oil? It gets it from algae. Now, those of you that like to take supplements for this, and some of you need it if you have dementia or signs of it, or certainly Alzheimer's disease in the early stage, you want to make sure you get online and you buy yourself a DHA that's coming from the algae. That's where the fish gets it from. The fish oil, by the way, is a carcinogen, contributes to cancer, heart disease, diabetes, etc. It's a rancid oil, a lipid peroxide, and so all of the holistic types that are telling you how good this is, they better do further research on it. They may want to read, and you may want to read my book, Killer Fish, that I detail the clear science on this one. Now, what I'm concerned about is that in early stage dementia and Alzheimer's disease, a lot can be done. But in late stage Alzheimer's, I've never seen anyone recover. And so you want to prevent this, and you want to, in fact, make sure if you have it, you catch it early. So anyone that you love and care for, even people that you just casually know, talk about this, because this is becoming a modern plague. Again, to review it once again, it's a lack of B12, a lack of essential fatty acids. And in the book I wrote years ago called Longevity, I talk about brain use. There were some wonderful studies done at Harvard University where they looked at the classic gene. There's a few genes we've identified, maybe 50 to 100, pretty well establishes this is the gene in this situation we see. Usually people have a problem. And one of these, the early ones they discovered, was the gene for Alzheimer's disease. Well, one of the stunning studies up there at Harvard was they took centurions, people 100 years old or beyond, and they found they had the classic gene, but they didn't have Alzheimer's disease. Now, what was differentiating that individual or that group of people from the other 99% of the people that were sitting there not knowing who they were? It was brain use. So these people were doing, in the old days, crossword puzzles, and today you have computer programs that help to train the brain, brain gyms, I guess you call them. They were socializing, they were out dating, they were reading, prolific readers, they were having animals versus people who didn't have animals. So this socialization and brain use is also something that helps to prevent. It stretches, uses the neuron functions of the brain, dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And it's harder when you have Alzheimer's disease, but if you have dementia, I've seen this be one of the most rapid ways that people can halt this and start to reverse it. Asthma is something that touched me personally. When I was just a boy, a 2.5-year-old boy, a little boy, I died from asthma. And I'll repeat, I said died. And I was very fortunate. I had one medical doctor in the family. He happened to be on call that day at the hospital. And he came down and revived me. And then when I woke up, within months or a year after that, I developed eczema, which is, by the way, brother of or sister of asthma. When the lungs do not work, the largest organ of the body, the skin, tries to breathe, and that's the resulting effect, eczema. And I endured that when I started to like girls at 12 or 13 years old, all the way through until I radically changed my diet. I gave up dairy food, and two things happened when I gave up dairy food. I lost the most weight. When I gave up meat, I lost weight. When I gave up dairy food, I must have lost 3 times more, 5 times faster. And within a matter of 2.5 months, my eczema was gone, and for the first time in my memory, as a young man in my early 20s, I could breathe freely. And it has never returned. Now, moving into my late 60s, I can assure you that my lungs are like the average person at 20. And I wasn't a good boy when I was young, because I smoked cigarettes when I was young also. I smoked marijuana when I was young also. I lived in the New York City area, not a great place to get fresh air. Car fumes had lead in it in those days. My house, as all homes, are 6 to 7 times more polluted than outside. You live in a bad polluted city, now we know from environmental protection agencies globally that the average home inside is 6 to 7 times more polluted. And so all of these things can create asthmatic conditions. One of the sad things for me, there are certain inner city schools here in the United States I can talk about because I've actually seen these schools, where 100% of the children in those schools have asthma. So are there other environmental factors, or what would be called epigenetic factors? And the answer is yes. Mold, not only black mold, but mold is another big cause of this. I happen to live in a state where it's very humid. Many of you listening today now live in humid places, and that could be a problem. You could have mold in your house. There's test kits for this. And you may be asthmatic along with taking dairy, along with eating gluten, another one of the problems. You could have mold in your house. You could also be in a situation where you're in a business that is highly toxic. Welders have more asthma, for instance, than a person who's an office worker. But how about the office worker that actually is the one that makes all the copies at the office? Well, there's been some studies done on that. People next to copy machines are going to have more lung conditions than people who are not. And let's broaden this beyond asthma. The chronic part of that is COPD. And this is an emerging disorder that's insane. They estimate, just like kidneys, maybe by the end of the 21st century, half of us will have kidney problems, about the same number as being floated about lung problems, COPD. And emphysema is one of these. You don't have to be a smoker, just like lung cancer. We used to think that everyone who had lung cancer were smokers. Now there's clear evidence, really empirically rich data, that shows us 25% of the people have never smoked cigarettes who have lung cancer. Well, it's from all these environmental factors that we're now discussing with you. Cancer is something that the institute I've had the honor and privilege to direct since 1980 is what we're working with on an ongoing basis. Now, all kinds of people come to Hippocrates. Thank goodness half the people that come to us today are healthy. They want to come so they don't get sick and they don't get old and they don't suffer. But the other half, a high percentage of them have different forms of cancer. Now, the specialist, the oncologist, would like you to believe that one cancer is different than another, and it's not. There's only two distinguished forms of cancer. One is called floating cancer. That's called leukemia. And the other one is called masses. That's where cells come together. And when you hear different names, melanoma, carcinoma, sarcoma, it actually identifies the growth pattern and the area of the body that that cancer is in. These are mutated cells. And if you go back into the medical literature a century ago, cancer was almost a nondescript disorder and disease. It was less than 5% of the population ever endured or contracted cancer. And when they looked at that, these were people that were miners, people that were around a lot of toxic mass. It was only the beginning of the chemical era. You know, the industrial age had happened only 60 years before that. And the population was very small. We had 1/5 of the population we have now on the planet Earth a century ago. And with all of that taken into account, when we started to have more people and more products and more chemicals and more pollution in the air and the water, and we started to create synthetic clothing, which only happened after the Second World War. Another event that happened after the Second World War, we started to insanely put deadly pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides on our food. We started to create plastic. Plastic was a non-entity. We didn't have plastic before. And all of this together collapsed the human immunity. Now, on top of that, we started to become stressed. Before we had cell phones and television and radio, think about what we have, and mass communication and constant communication and relentless communication and expected to communicate, the stress load was minimal. A colleague of mine that used to teach at one of the Ivy League universities, psychology, said, when we looked at this and mathematically equated it, we think that a person from the year 1900 versus a person from the year 2000 and beyond, we have about 15,000 times more stress than a person did a century ago. And that's not hard to understand. My grandparents and great-grandparents knew their family, knew their neighbors, and practically went nowhere else. There was no such thing as a plane. You didn't get in a plane and fly around the world. You didn't know what was going on anywhere in the world. Radios didn't exist then. And then radios came in, and that was a big event. We started to have communication. How about televisions? When I was a little boy, television just hit the scene. And there were 3 channels, and they were only on at night. Now there are hundreds of channels, and around the clock you can be stressed out of your mind. If you don't have enough problems, turn on the news. They'll give you more problems and the shows. So stress is a big part of this. Also, what that does to the human brain. If you said to me, Brian, reduce this to the number 1 cause of cancer, the number 2 cause of cancer, the number 3 cause of cancer, we're going to do that now. It's perception is number 1. So if you're negative, if you're stressed, if you don't know how to cope with stress, what we now know is that completely creates maladjustment within the hormonal system of the body. Hormones are the messengers in the body, chemical language in the body. So when one cell speaks to another cell, it's these chemistries, hormones, that make it happen. Now, if they're all running around crazy and they don't know what to do and how to do it, are cells communicating? And the answer is no. And if cells do not communicate, is it easy to mutate a cell? The answer is obvious, yes. So the number 1 is a stress load factor that causes cancer. I cannot count the number of people I've worked with that had a stressful event. Their husband, their wife died, a child died, they lost something dear to themselves, and within a matter of days, they contracted cancer. I saw it in my own family with my grandfather. My grandmother died after a noble battle with colon cancer. 2 months later, and by the way, he was doing an exam, a medical exam, after she died. Our family had him do it. 2 months later, he died of a mass brain tumor. This is what happens with uncontrollable thoughts. Sadness, a broken heart is literal. The second cause is the environmental cause that we just elaborated on. And you've got to be clear. Every drop of drinking water in the world, know it or not, has plastics and pharmaceutical drugs in it. They intentionally put in many parts of the world chlorine into water. Chlorine's a carcinogen. Not maybe, it's a carcinogen. It was created during the First World War to maim and kill people. It's called chlorine gas. And only after the war, and they had no way to sell their product, did they convince people to put it in water, which did remedy one thing. It took care of all the deaths that were coming from waterborne diseases. Bacteria's in the water, virus in the water, amoebas in the water, parasites in the water, but then it gave us a whole nother disease called cancer. Fluoride, we've known for God knows how long that fluoride is a carcinogen. Matter of fact, the Environmental Protection Agency here in the United States in 1993 put an alert out that fluoride causes cancer, all forms of cancer, not only thyroid cancer. And the fact of the matter is, they should have now had the Environmental Protection Agency and the FDA make a law to outlaw it. But the fact of the matter is, they did that in Europe. Every country in Europe has not permitted fluoride into the water for a long time. The only country that made a pact with the United States is Ireland. So you cannot get fluoride in the water. And by the way, the fluoride, the chemical fluoride they put in the water, will not build bones and will not build teeth. You may want to read the Hippocrates Heal Our World magazine that you get on the Hippocrates website, HippocratesInstitute.org, because we write about these things. We write the latest science on these things. And so the fact is very simple. This is a cause of cancer. And we can go on. How about a book I wrote with my wife, Anna Maria, about a decade ago called Killer Clothes? Many of you are eating healthy, exercising, have great attitudes, great marriages, great relationships, great work, have everything that you think you need. And you're killing yourself by wearing polyesters and nylons, and even no ironing 100% cotton shirts, which are formaldehyde, by the way. And so if you want to put deadly chemicals into your body, you don't have to do it with pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides. Just do not wear cotton and linen and natural fiber clothes, because all other clothes are oil. They're literally oil, and they don't stop emitting gases. Matter of fact, a study was done about 30 years ago, maybe more, where they actually saw a polyester shirt which was washed 1,000 times, emitting only 3 to 4% less gases 10 years later. 1 decade later, 1,000 washes later, it still emitted 96, 97% of the gases it did the day it was manufactured. How about the dyes they put in this? In this book, we report some of the most deadly jobs on the planet Earth is to work in these garment industries, generally in third world countries, so that you can buy inexpensive clothing here in the West. Bad news. This all causes problems. And the next one, which you suspected I would talk about first, is diet. If you eat animals, if you drink the milk out of animal bosoms, you're a pervert. Let's start with that one. You are, in fact, putting fats into your body and deadly chemicals. They pump antibiotics into these animals. Don't tell me free-range ones do not have it. They still have laws where they pump antibiotics into them, maybe less. The truth of the matter is, animal fat is where heavy metals and chemicals like to hang out. Either the animal fat that you're eating or your body animal fat. So if you want more heavy metals and chemicals, just get fatter and eat fat and drink fat, called milk, eat cheese, all of the things that have fat in it. The other thing I may say to you about diet, it's not good enough just to stop doing something. You've got to eat things that have medicine, phytochemicals in it that prevent cancers. They make the cell hormonally start to do the right thing. And these are called phytochemicals. And the only place that we find phytochemicals, listen closely, this is not an opinion, this is science. The only place we find phytochemicals are in raw, organic, plant-based foods. If you're not eating a raw, organic, plant-based food, you may not be eating the culprits, but you're actually allowing cancer culprits and viral culprits and bacterial culprits and fungal culprits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to come into the body and to seed itself. When you have these phytochemicals from rich, organic, plant-based, raw food, you will not. You'll prevent this. You'll give hormones to the body that the intelligence of the cell rises. So again, let's go through the list. Attitude number 1. Number 2, clearly, chemicals, avoid them. Your environment, how you eat, what you wear, everything, how you live, your office. And number 3, your diet. Now, there's some other auxiliary or additions to this. Exercise. We just saw a study the other day. It was wonderful to see that women who did casual walking, we're not talking about speed walking, reduce her chance of contracting breast cancer by 4 times. How about that? And reoccurrence by 7 times. So if you had cancer and it went into remission, 7 times less chance of reoccurring just by doing moderate amounts of walking on a daily basis.